Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Soft Stories. I'm Stratton, and this is Pepper, and today we are going to be continuing our reading of Silas Marner by George Eliot. When last we left off, we were in attendance of a Christmas party and had met Godfrey Cass's beloved, who he believes he is not worthy of, a belief which he has yet to prove incorrect. We'll have to see what happens next, however, before we can make our final judgments. So let's dive right in with chapter 12, which begins, while Godfrey Cass was taking draughts of forgetfulness from the sweet presence of Nancy, willingly losing all sense of that hidden bond which at other moments galled and fretted him so as to mingle irritation with the very sunshine. Godfrey's wife was walking with slow, uncertain steps through the snow-covered Raveloe lanes, carrying her child in her arms. This journey on New Year's Eve was a premeditated act of vengeance which she had kept in her heart ever since Godfrey, in a fit of passion, had told her he would sooner die than acknowledge her as his wife. There would be a great party at the Red House on New Year's Eve, she knew. Her husband would be smiling and smiled upon, hiding her existence in the darkest corner of his heart. But she would mar his pleasure. She would go in her dingy rags, with her faded face, once as handsome as the best, with her little child that had its father's hair and eyes, and disclose herself to the squire as his eldest son's wife. It is seldom that the miserable can help regarding their misery as a wrong inflicted by those who are less miserable. Molly knew that the cause of her dingy rags was not her husband's neglect, but the demon opium to which she was enslaved, body and soul, except in the lingering mother's tenderness that refused to give him her hungry child. She knew this well, and yet, in the moments of wretched, unbenumbed consciousness, the sense of her want and degradation transformed itself continually into bitterness towards Godfrey. He was well off, and if she had her rights, she would be well off too. The belief that he repented his marriage and suffered from it only aggravated her vindictiveness. Just and self-reproving thoughts do not come to us too thickly, even in the purest air, and with the best lessons of heaven and earth, how should those white-winged, delicate messengers make their way to Molly's poisoned chamber, inhabited by no higher memories than those of a barmaid's paradise, of pink ribbons and gentlemen's jokes? She had set out at an early hour, but had lingered on the road, inclined by her indolence to believe that if she waited under a warm shed, the snow would cease to fall. She had waited longer than she knew, and now that she found herself belated in the snow-hidden ruggedness of the long lanes, even the animation of a vindictive purpose could not keep her spirit from failing. It was 7 o'clock, and by this time she was not very far from Raveloe. But she was not familiar enough with those monotonous lanes to know how near she was to her journey's end. She needed comfort, and she knew but one comforter, the familiar demon in her bosom. But she hesitated a moment, after drawing out the black remnant, before she raised it to her lips. In that moment the mother's love pleaded for painful consciousness rather than oblivion, pleaded to be left in aching weariness, rather than to have encircling arms benumbed so that they could not feel their dear burden. In another moment Molly had flung something away, but it was not the black remnant. It was an empty vial. And she walked on again under the breaking cloud, from which there came now and then the light of a quickly veiled star, for a freezing wind had sprung up since the snowing had ceased. But she walked always more and more drowsily, and clutched more and more automatically the sleeping child at her bosom. Slowly the demon was working his will, and cold and weariness were his helpers. Soon she felt nothing but a supreme, immediate longing that curtained off all futurity, the longing to lie down and sleep. She had arrived at a spot where her footsteps were no longer checked by a hedgerow, and she had wandered vaguely, unable to distinguish any objects, notwithstanding the wide whiteness around her and the growing starlight. She sank down against a straggling furze bush, an easy pillow enough, and the bed of snow, too, was soft. She did not feel that the bed was cold, and did not heed whether the child would wake and cry for her. But her arms had not yet relaxed their instinctive clutch, and the little one slumbered on, as gently as if it had been rocked in a lace-trimmed cradle. But the complete torpor came at last. The fingers lost their tension, the arms unbent. Then the little head fell away from the bosom, and the blue eyes opened wide on the cold starlight. At first there was a little peevish cry of "Mammy," and an effort to regain the pillowing arm and bosom, but Mammy's ear was deaf, and the pillow seemed to be slipping away backward. Suddenly, as the child rolled downward on its mother's knees, all wet with snow, its eyes were caught by a bright, glancing light on the white ground, and with the ready transition of infancy, it was immediately absorbed in watching the bright, living thing running towards it, yet never arriving. The bright, living thing must be caught, and in an instant the child had slipped on all fours and held out one little hand to catch the gleam. But the gleam would not be caught in that way, and now the head was held up to see where the cunning gleam came from. It came from a very bright place, and the little one, rising on its legs, toddled through the snow, the old grimy shawl in which it was wrapped trailing behind it, and the queer little bonnet dangling at its back, toddled on to the open door of Silas Marner's cottage, and right up to the warm hearth, where there was a bright fire of logs and sticks, which had thoroughly warmed the old sack, Silas's greatcoat, spread on the bricks to dry. The little one, accustomed to be left to itself for long hours without notice from its mother, squatted down on the sack and spread its tiny hands towards the blaze in perfect contentment, gurgling and making many inarticulate communications to the cheerful fire, like a new-hatched gosling beginning to find itself comfortable. But presently the warmth had a lulling effect, and the little golden head sank down on the old sack, and the blue eyes were veiled by their delicate, half-transparent lids. But where was Silas Marner while this strange visitor had come to his hearth? He was in the cottage, but he did not see the child. During the last few weeks, since he had lost his money, he had contracted the habit of opening his door and looking out from time to time, as if he thought that his money might be somehow coming back to him, or that some trace, some news of it, might be mysteriously on the road and be caught by the listening ear or the straining eye. It was chiefly at night, when he was not occupied in his loom, that he fell into this repetition of an act for which he could have assigned no definite purpose, and which can hardly be understood except by those who have undergone a bewildering separation from a supremely loved object. In the evening twilight, and later, whenever the night was not dark, Silas looked out on that narrow prospect round the stone pits, glistening and gazing, not with hope, but with mere yearning and unrest. This morning he had been told by some of his neighbours that it was New Year's Eve, and that he must sit up and hear the old year rung out and the new rung in, because that was good luck and might bring his money back again. This was only a friendly Raveloe way of jesting with the half-crazy oddities of a miser, but it had, perhaps, helped to throw Silas into a more than usually excited state. Since the oncoming of twilight, he had opened his door again and again, though only to shut it immediately at seeing all distance veiled by the falling snow. But the last time he opened it, the snow had ceased, and the clouds were parting here and there. He stood and listened and gazed for a long while. There was really something on the road coming towards him then, but he caught no sight of it, and the stillness and the wide, trackless snow seemed to narrow his solitude with the chill of despair. He went in again and put his right hand on the latch of the door to close it, but he did not close it. He was arrested, as he had been already since his lost, by the invisible wand of catalepsy, and stood like a graven image with wide but sightless eyes, holding open his door, powerless to resist either the good or evil that might enter there. When Marner's sensibility returned, he continued the action which had been arrested, and closed his door, unaware of the chasm in his consciousness, unaware of any intermediate change, except that the light had grown dim, and that he was chilled and faint. He thought he had been too long standing at the door and looking out. Turning towards the hearth, where the two logs had fallen apart, and sent forth only a red, uncertain glimmer, he seated himself on his fireside chair, and was stooping to push his logs together, when, to his blurred vision, it seemed as if there were gold on the floor in front of the hearth. Gold! His own gold, brought back to him as mysteriously as it had been taken away. He felt his heart began to beat violently, and for a few moments he was unable to stretch out his hand and grasp the restored treasure. The heap of gold seemed to glow and get larger beneath his agitated gaze. He leaned forward at last and stretched forth his hand, but instead of the hard coin with the familiar resisting outline, his fingers encountered soft, warm curls. In utter amazement, Silas fell on his knees and bent his head low to examine the marvel. It was a sleeping child, a round, fair thing, with soft yellow rings all over its head. Could this be his little sister, come back to him in a dream? His little sister whom he had carried about in his arms for a year before she died, when he was a small boy without shoes or stockings? That was the first thought that darted across Silas's blank wonderment. Was it a dream? He rose to his feet again, pushed his logs together, and throwing on some dried leaves and sticks, raised a flame. But the flame did not disperse the vision. It only lit it up more distinctly, the little round form of the child, and its shabby clothing. It was very much like his sister. Silas sank into his chair, powerless, under the double presence of an inexplicable surprise and a hurrying influx of memories. How and when had the child come in without his knowledge? He had never been beyond the door. But along with that question, and almost thrusting it away, there was the vision of the old home and the old streets leading to Lantern Yard, and within that vision, another of the thoughts which had been present with him in those far-off scenes. The thoughts were strange to him now, like old friendships impossible to revive, and yet he had a dreamy feeling that this child was somehow a message come to him from that far-off life. It stirred fibres that had never been moved in Raveloe, old quiverings of tenderness, old impressions of awe at the presentiment of some power presiding over his life. For his imagination had not yet extricated itself from the sense of mystery in the child's sudden presence, and had formed no conjectures of ordinary natural means by which the event could have been brought about. But there was a cry on the hearth. The child had awakened, and Marner stooped to lift it on his knee. It clung round his neck and burst louder and louder into that mingling of inarticulate cries with "Mammy," by which little children express the bewilderment of waking. Silas pressed it to him, and almost unconsciously uttered sounds of hushing tenderness, while he bethought himself that some of his porridge, which had got cool by the dying fire, would do to feed the child with, if it were only warmed up a little. He had plenty to do through the next hour. The porridge, sweetened with some dry brown sugar from an old store which he had refrained from using for himself, stopped the cries of the little one, and made her lift her eyes with a wide, quiet gaze at Silas, as he put the spoon into her mouth. Presently she slipped from his knee and began to toddle about, but with a pretty stagger that made Silas jump up and follow her, lest she should fall against anything that would hurt her. But she only fell in a sitting posture on the ground, and began to pull at her boots, looking up at him with a crying face as if the boots hurt her. He took her on his knee again, but it was some time before it occurred to Silas's dull bachelor mind that the wet boots were the grievance, pressing on her warm ankles. He got them off with difficulty, and baby was at once happily occupied with the primary mystery of her own toes, inviting Silas, with much chuckling, to consider the mystery too. But the wet boots had, at last, suggested to Silas that the child had been walking on the snow, and this roused him from his entire oblivion of any ordinary means by which it could have entered or been brought into his house. Under the prompting of this new idea, and without waiting to form conjectures, he raised the child in his arms and went to the door. As soon as he had opened it, there was a cry of "Mammy" again, which Silas had not heard since the child's first hungry waking. Bending forward, he could just discern the marks made by the little feet on the virgin snow, and he followed their track to the furze bushes. "Mammy!" the little one cried again and again, stretching itself forward so as almost to escape from Silas's arms, before he himself was aware that there was something more than the bush before him, that there was a human body, with the head sunk low in the furs and half covered with the shaken snow. Chapter 13. It was after the early supper time at the Red House, and the entertainment was in that stage when bashfulness itself had passed into easy jollity, when gentlemen, conscious of unusual accomplishments, could at length be prevailed on to dance a hornpipe, and when the squire preferred talking loudly, scattering snuff, and patting his visitors' backs, to sitting longer at the whist table, a choice exasperating to Uncle Kimble, who, being always volatile in sober business hours, became intense and bitter over cards and brandy, shuffled before his adversary's deal with a glare of suspicion, and turned up a mean trump card with an air of inexpressible disgust, as if, in a world where such things could happen, one might as well enter on a course of reckless profligacy. When the evening had advanced to this pitch of freedom and enjoyment, it was usual for the servants, the heavy duties of supper being well over, to get their share of amusement by coming to look on at the dancing, so that the back regions of the house were left in solitude. There were two doors by which the white parlour was entered from the hall, and they were both standing open for the sake of air. But the lower one was crowded with the servants and villagers, and only the upper doorway was left free. Bob Cass was figuring in a hornpipe, and his father, very proud of this lithe son, whom he repeatedly declared to be just like himself in his young days, in a tone that implied this to be the very slightest stamp of juvenile merit, was the centre of a group who had placed themselves opposite the performer, not far from the upper door. Godfrey was standing a little way off, not to admire his brother's dancing, but to keep sight of Nancy, who was seated in the group near her father. He stood aloof, because he wished to avoid suggesting himself as a subject for the squire's fatherly jokes in connection with matrimony and Miss Nancy Lammeter's beauty, which were likely to become more and more explicit. But he had the prospect of dancing with her again when the hornpipe was concluded, and in the meanwhile it was very pleasant to get long glances at her, quite unobserved. But when Godfrey was lifting his eyes from one of those long glances, they encountered an object as startling to him at that moment as if it had been an apparition from the dead. It was an apparition from that hidden life which lies, like a dark by-street, behind the goodly ornamented facade that meets the sunlight and the gaze of respectable admirers. It was his own child, carried in Silas Marner's arms. That was his instantaneous impression, unaccompanied by doubt, though he had not seen the child for months past, and when the hope was rising that he might possibly be mistaken, Mr. Crackenthorpe and Mr. Lammeter had already advanced to Silas, in astonishment at this strange event. Godfrey joined them immediately, unable to rest without hearing every word, trying to control himself, but conscious that if anyone noticed him, they must see that he was white-lipped and trembling. But now all eyes at that end of the room were bent on Silas Marner. The squire himself had risen, and asked angrily, "How's this? What's this? What do you do, coming in here this way?" "I'm come for the doctor. I want the doctor," Silas had said, in the first moment, to Mr. Crackenthorpe. "Why, what's the matter, Marner?" said the rector. "The doctor's here, but say quietly what you want him for." "It's a woman," said Silas, speaking low and half breathlessly, just as Godfrey came up. "She's dead, I think. Dead in the snow at the stone pits, not far from my door." Godfrey felt a great throb. There was one terror in his mind at that moment. It was that the woman might not be dead. That was an evil terror, an ugly inmate to have found a nestling place in Godfrey's kindly disposition. But no disposition is a security from evil wishes to a man whose happiness hangs on duplicity. "Hush, hush," said Mr. Crackenthorpe. "Go out into the hall there. I'll fetch the doctor to you. Found a woman in the snow, and thinks she's dead," he added, speaking low to the squire. "Better say as little about it as possible. It will shock the ladies. Just tell them a poor woman is ill from cold and hunger. I'll go and fetch Kimball." By this time, however, the ladies had pressed forward, curious to know what could have brought the solitary linen weaver there under such strange circumstances, and interested in the pretty child, who, half alarmed and half attracted by the brightness and the numerous company, now frowned and hid her face, now lifted up her head again and looked round placably, until a touch or a coaxing word brought back the frown, and made her bury her face with new determination. "What child is it?" said several ladies at once, and among the rest Nancy Lammeter, addressing Godfrey. "I don't know. Some poor woman's who has been found in the snow, I believe," was the answer Godfrey wrung from himself with a terrible effort. "After all, am I certain?" he hastened to add silently, in anticipation of his own conscience. "Why, you'd better leave the child here then, Master Marner," said good-natured Mrs. Kimball. hesitating, however, to take those dingy clothes into contact with her own ornamented satin bodice. "I'll tell one of the girls to fetch it." No, I can't part with it. I can't let it go," said Silas abruptly. "It's come to me. I've a right to keep it." The proposition to take the child from him had come to Silas quite unexpectedly, and his speech, uttered under a strong, sudden impulse, was almost like a revelation to himself. A minute before, he had no distinct intention about the child. "Did you ever hear the like?" said Mrs. Kimball, in mild surprise to her neighbour. "Now, ladies, I must trouble you to stand aside," said Mr. Kimball, coming from the card-room in some bitterness at the interruption, but drilled by the long habit of his profession into obedience to unpleasant calls, even when he was hardly sober. "It's a nasty business turning out now, eh, Kimball?" said the squire. "He might have gone for your young fellow. The apprentice there, what's his name?" "Might? Hey, what's the use of talking about might?" growled Uncle Kimball, hastening out with Marner and followed by Mr. Crackenthorpe and Godfrey. "Get me a pair of thick boots, will you, Godfrey? And stay, let somebody run to Winthorpe's and fetch Dolly. She's the best woman to get. Ben was here himself before supper. Is he gone?" "Yes, sir, I met him," said Marner, "but I couldn't stop to tell him anything, only I said I was going for the doctor, and he said the doctor was at the squire's. And I made haste and ran, and there was nobody to be seen at the back of the house, so I went in to where the company was." The child, no longer distracted by the bright light and the smiling women's faces, began to cry and call for Mammy, though always clinging to Marner, who had, apparently, won her through confidence. Godfrey had come back with the boots, and felt the cry, as if some fibre were drawn tight within him. "I'll go," he said, eager for some movement. "I'll go and fetch the woman, Mrs. Winthorpe." "Oh, pooh, send somebody else," said Uncle Kimball, hurrying away with Marner. "You'll let me know if I can be of any use, Kimball," said Mr. Crackenthorpe, but the doctor was out of hearing. Godfrey, too, had disappeared. He was gone to snatch his hat and coat, having just reflection enough to remember that he must not look like a madman, but he rushed out of the house into the snow without heeding his thin shoes. In a few minutes he was on his rapid way to the stone pits by the side of Dolly, who, though feeling that she was entirely in her place in encountering cold and snow on an errand of mercy, was much concerned at a young gentleman's getting his feet wet under a like impulse. "You'd a deal better go back, sir," said Dolly, with respectful compassion. "You've no call to catch cold, and I'd ask you if you'd be so good as to tell my husband to come on your way back. He's at the Rainbow, I doubt, if you found him anyway sober enough to be of use, or else there's Mrs. Snell that happen to send the boy up to fetch and carry, for there may be things wanted from the doctors." "No, I'll stay. Now I'm once out, I'll stay outside here," said Godfrey, when they came opposite Marner's cottage. "You can come and tell me if I can do anything." "Well, sir, you're very good. You've a tender heart," said Dolly, going to the door. Godfrey was too painfully preoccupied to feel a twinge of self-reproach at this undeserved praise. He walked up and down, unconscious that he was plunging ankle-deep in snow, unconscious of everything but trembling suspense about what was going on in the cottage and the effect of each alternative on his future lot. No, not quite unconscious of everything else. Deeper down, and half smothered by passionate desire and dread, there was the sense that he ought not to be waiting on these alternatives, that he ought to accept the consequences of his deeds, own the miserable wife, and fulfill the claims of the helpless child. But he had not moral courage enough to contemplate that active renunciation of Nancy as possible for him. He had only conscience and heart enough to make him forever uneasy under the weakness that forbade the renunciation. At this moment, his mind leaped away from all restraint towards the sudden prospect of deliverance from his long bondage. "Is she dead?" said the voice that predominated over every other within him. "If she is, I may marry Nancy, and then I shall be a good fellow in future and have no secrets, and the child shall be taken care of somehow." But across that vision came the other possibility. She may live, and then it's all up with me. Godfrey never knew how long it was before the door of the cottage opened and Mr. Kimball came out. He went forward to meet his uncle, prepared to suppress the agitation he must feel, whatever news he was to hear. "I waited for you, as I'd come so far," he said, speaking first. "Pooh! It was nonsense for you to come out. Why didn't you send one of the men? There's nothing to be done. She's dead. Has been dead for hours, I should say." "What sort of a woman is she?" said Godfrey, feeling the blood rush to his face. "A young woman, but emaciated, with long black hair. Some vagrant, quite in rags. She's got a wedding ring on, however. They must fetch her away to the workhouse tomorrow. Come along." "I want to look at her," said Godfrey. I think I saw such a woman yesterday. I'll overtake you in a minute or so." Mr. Kimball went on, and Godfrey turned back to the cottage. He cast only one glance at the dead face on the pillow, which Dolly had smoothed with decent care. But he remembered that last look at his unhappy, hated wife so well that at the end of 16 years, every line in the worn face was present to him when he told the full story of this night. He turned immediately towards the hearth where Silas Marner sat, lulling the child. She was perfectly quiet now, but not asleep, only soothed by the sweet porridge and warmth into that wide-gazing calm which makes us older human beings, with our inward turmoil, feel a certain awe in the presence of a little child, such as we feel before some quiet majesty or beauty in the earth or sky, before a steady glowing planet, or a full-flowered eglantine, or the bending trees over a silent pathway. The wide-open blue eyes looked up at Godfrey's without any uneasiness or sign of recognition. The child could make no visible, audible claim on its father, and the father felt a strange mixture of feelings, a conflict of regret and joy, that the pulse of that little heart had no response for the half-jealous yearning in his own. When the blue eyes turned away from him slowly and fixed themselves on the weaver's queer face, which was bent low down to look at them, while the small hand began to pull Marner's withered cheek with loving disfiguration. "You'll take the child to the parish tomorrow?" asked Godfrey, speaking as indifferently as he could. "Who says so?" said Marner sharply. "Will they make me take her?" "Why, you wouldn't like to keep her, should you? An old bachelor like you." "Till anybody shows they've a right to take her away from me," said Marner. "The mother's dead. I reckon it's got no father. It's a lone thing. And I'm a lone thing. My money's gone, I don't know where. And this has come from I don't know where. I know nothing. I'm partly mazed." "Poor little thing," said Godfrey. "Let me give something towards finding it clothes." He put a hand in his pocket and found half a guinea, and thrusting it into Silas's hand, he hurried out of the cottage to overtake Mr. Kimball. "Ah, I see it's not the same woman I saw," he said, as he came up. "It's a pretty little child. The old fellow seems to want to keep it. That's strange for a miser like him. But I gave him a trifle to help him out. The parish isn't likely to quarrel with him for the right to keep the child." "No. But I've seen the time when I might have quarrelled with him for it myself. It's too late now, though. If the child ran into the fire, your aunt's too fat to overtake it. She could only sit and grunt like an alarmed sow. But what a fool you are, Godfrey, to come out in your dancing shoes and stockings in this way. And you are one of the beaux of the evening, and at your own house. What do you mean by such freaks, young fellow? Has Miss Nancy been cruel, and do you want to spite her by spoiling your pumps?" "Oh, everything's been disagreeable tonight. I was tired to death of jigging and gallanting, and that bother about the hornpipes. And I'd got to dance with the other Miss Gunn," said Godfrey, glad of the subterfuge his uncle had suggested to him. The prevarication and white lies which a mind that keeps itself ambitiously pure is as uneasy under as a great artist under the false touches that no eye detects but his own, are worn as lightly as mere trimmings when once the actions have become a lie. Godfrey reappeared in the white parlour with dry feet, and since the truth must be told, with a sense of relief and gladness that was too strong for painful thoughts to struggle with. For could he not venture now, whenever opportunity offered, to say the tenderest things to Nancy Lammeter, to promise her and himself that he would always be just what she would desire to see him? There was no danger that his dead wife would be recognized. Those were not the days of active inquiry and wide report. And as for the registry of their marriage, That was a long way off, buried in unturned pages away from everyone's interest but his own. Dunsey might betray him if he came back, but Dunsey might be won to silence. And when events turn out so much better for a man than he had reason to dread, is it not a proof that his conduct has been less foolish and blameworthy than it might otherwise have appeared? When we are treated well, we naturally begin to think that we are not altogether unmeritorious, and that it is only just that we should treat ourselves well, and not mar our own good fortune. Where, after all, would be the use of his confessing the past to Nancy Lammeter, and throwing away his happiness, nay, hers? For he felt some confidence that she loved him. As for the child, he would see that it was cared for. He would never forsake it. He would do everything but own it. Perhaps it would be just as happy in life without being owned by its father, seeing that nobody could tell how things would turn out. And that, is there any other reason wanted? Well, then the father would be much happier without owning the child. And on that excellent example of self-rationalization, we will end our story for today. What a beautifully written passage. The depictions of the inner workings of Godfrey's mind make me so angry, and that is the sign, I think, of a great writer. I hope that despite the contemptible character within, you have enjoyed our reading today, and will join us next time on Soft Stories. I look forward to seeing you. But until next we meet, I must wish you all the best, and goodbye.